Hey everybody, we're going to look at civil rights today. When you talk about civil rights, you're talking about those protections that we grant to groups of people who might have been discriminated against throughout our history. You might also hear the phrase civil liberties. Well, when you're talking about civil liberties, you're talking about your First Amendment freedoms and how we protect individuals from government interference. But civil rights deals with groups of people, and so they're kind of intertwined with one another, but also they are separate at the same time. And from a local perspective, when you focus on the issue of segregation, you talk about how the 50 states, or at least in that time, the several states, could come up with their own segregation laws and separate them, have people separated based on race. We had a separate but equal clause, or a separate but equal ruling, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which allowed for segregation in the states to decide if they wanted to segregate or not. Then you also had Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, which overturned the Plessy case, which ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. The way that you had states, or that you got states, especially from the old Confederacy, to go on board with Brown versus the Board of Education was to pass a law through Congress signed by President Johnson called the Civil Rights Act, which if they decided to not desegregate, or continue to segregate, then the federal government would withhold federal funds from that state. So in order for states to get on board with this Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, it took about 10 years for individual states to realize that the federal government would withhold money from them. So in 1954, there was really no teeth behind what the federal government said through that Supreme Court case. It wasn't until 10 years later where states had to abide by the law. And here you see the various states that segregated or didn't segregate. So how did we desegregate schools? When you read through the text and you go online, you find that we had busing, where we would bus African American kids, minority students, to white schools. What happened then is that many whites would leave those schools, and we had something called white flight. And here's a bit more about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You also had affirmative action laws and the arguments against affirmative action. And here you see the differences in poverty and median income level amongst the populations in the United States. We tend to broad brush Hispanics all in one group, but also you have to realize there are several classifications of Hispanic Americans in the United States, ethnic backgrounds: Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cuban Americans. And just like African Americans, Hispanics have been involved in politics in the United States and have seen voter turnout go up slightly in some areas, and you also see the differences in how they support Democratic or Republican politics. And most recently with Native Americans, the Supreme Court ruled that the treaties that have been passed throughout the years have been broken by the federal government, and most of eastern Oklahoma is tribal land. And here you see the reservations that were created throughout the years. And civil rights also extends to people with disabilities. It also deals with age, gender laws, the discussions that liberals and conservatives had over abortion and sexual orientation.